Thank you so much. Well, why don't we just go home now? Can't top that. The
Alan?
trick is if they do that when you're done. That's the
Alan, I'm trying to think if there's a medium, a creative medium you haven't worked in, from theater to film, from primetime television to PBS, from published author to podcasting. I guess the only thing left off from your resume is video games. And I'm kind of hoping maybe you can figure out a way that you can make West Wing come alive and take us into an alternate universe.
No, I've been around so long, I've seen the death of burlesque, vaudeville, movies, television, and now I'm working on getting rid of podcasts.
Let's go back. Let's go back to the beginning, post-burlesque. And I'm wondering, did you have the energy, the zeal, the curiosity at the start of your acting career that you've had over the last few decades?
Oh, sure. You've got to have energy and zeal, and you got to be willing to stick to it in spite of all the evidence against you're doing that. The evidence being that nobody will give you a job. You know, I mean, almost everybody I know goes through that. You know, look what I just did. The only person I know who didn't go through that is Meryl Streep. She got out of acting school and went right to work, and I don't know anybody else who did that.
Mm-hmm. Well, you got out of Fordham in 1956.
I think they were applauding 1956. It was a great year.
And even at Fordham, you said you got some work on Broadway as an understudy.
Yeah, it was partly through the help of my father, I think. I was an understudy to Don Murray in a play called The Hot Corner that Sam Levine was in. Sam Levine was a great actor who had been in Guys and Dolls. He was extraordinary. I watched Guys and Dolls because my father was playing Sky Masterson. And I watched from the wings, and Sam, every night, would say the same lines standing in the same place, but he'd do them so differently that the laughs would come in different places. From a Broadway house, the laughs are usually in boom, right, where you know where they're going to come. Mm-hmm. I was astonished to watch him I learned more about acting watching from the wings than I did any other way.
And just
I didn't really answer your question.
Of course you did. Just a few years out of Fordham, you get a job on The Phil Silvers Show in 1958. What was it like in these early days of television for an actor?
What was it like?
Yeah, what was it like?
It was a lot like what it is now. that Phil Silvers, he knew my family because he had carried me on stage in burlesque when I was 6 months old. My father was a singer and a straight man in burlesque. As the singer, he would sing while the chorus girls paraded in the opening number. And so his official position was known as the tit singer. I don't mean to offend anybody. That was the actual name given to the job my father had.
See, this is an educational experience.
Oh, there's so much to learn from this. And so I would watch burlesque from the wings, and watching the comics and the chorus girls and the strippers. It was an education. It was education watching the strippers. They were a little standoffish, but the chorus girls were very motherly to me, and I really enjoyed being with them. Mm-hmm. But years later, when Phil hired me to play a really big, kind of important part in that episode, I had never been on television in that way before, with that big a part. Mm-hmm. And I hadn't acted in front of a camera much. I had mostly acted on the stage. And I didn't know you were supposed to know your lines before going in. I actually didn't know that. I thought, because on the stage, the way I learned my lines was rehearsing them. I was quick. I'd have the script in my hand, play the scene 2 or 3 times in rehearsal, and I could put the script down and do it. That wasn't going to work on the Phil Silver show, because the first thing they said was, okay, we're ready for your scene. It was a telephone scene where I got all the lines for a page. And I hadn't learned it. I forget what happened. I know I didn't get fired because the show you can still see it on YouTube. But it was really embarrassing when I realized I was supposed to understand. But you know what? I've always had the problem that I can't learn lines off a piece of paper. It's very hard for me.
Mm-hmm.
I have to do it. I have to hear it, say it. So over the years, I finally developed the iPhone method.
Which is?
Which is, I record the scene, reading all the parts. So I know which is my part. I read my part in a normal voice, but I read the other parts in a cartoon voice. Why are you holding that gun? I'm holding the gun because I'm like, oh, don't do that. That's a terrible thing. If I act in a scene with more than 2 people, I'm out of luck. But that way, I do it and I play it. I stop the machine or stop the phone when it's time to say my line, and I say it, and then I play it again, and then I find out whether or not I'm right or wrong, and it corrects me. So that's a good method for me, because I need to play it. I don't learn the words, I learn what's under the words.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes me say the words. And the other person makes me say the words. Including if I'm on the telephone, I hear what the other person's saying to me. Or if I'm in a monologue, I hear what the train of thought is and why the next sentence comes out of my mouth, because something has happened in my head. Or if I'm talking to the audience, I'm really trying to see if they're getting what I'm saying. So to me, it's all dialogue.
Mm-hmm. You were fortunate. You went from Phil Silver's to a couple of other East Coast TV series, and then Broadway. Your first Broadway production was called Only in America, which was a year after Phil Silver's. But your first really big one was Purlie Victorious in 1962. We have a lot of people who remember the past in this audience.
Purlie was a wonderful show. Ossie Davis wrote it and starred in it with Ruby Dee. And it was really very sad for me because it was a breakthrough kind of thing. It was a farcical deconstruction of stereotypes, racial stereotypes. That's how he meant it, that's how audiences accepted it. And 10 or 20 years later, the movement decided that it was retrograde and put it down. They took the stereotypes without any irony. Mm-hmm. And I was really sorry to see that because he had made a real contribution, and he was such a dedicated person with his heart and soul to equality and justice. So that's my feeling about that.
Mm-hmm. Shifting gears, it was next on Broadway with The Owl and the Pussycat.
Yeah, well, there were a bunch of plays where I was in with small parts or big parts. But The Owl and the Pussycat was a big change. It was just Diana Sands and me. She and I had worked in an improvising company together.
Paul Sills was
No, well, Paul, I worked with Paul after I did a summer season in Hyannisport, where we did a version of Compass, which was all improvised. We had, for the first hour, sketches we had created in rehearsal that started from improvisations and then got refined. The second hour was after I ended the first act, asking the audience for headlines or words, things that would be the subject of of sketches in the second hour. The second hour was all spot improvisations. But it was guts improvising. You just went out on stage and tried to be funny no matter what you came up with. You didn't know where it came from. There was no discipline to it. And nevertheless, Diana was in that, and some Rennie Santoni, Honey Shepherd, wonderful people. And about a year later, Paul asked me if I wanted to be part of a workshop on the stage at Second City, but not doing Second City stuff. We were doing theater games, which had been invented by his mother decades earlier, Viola Spolin. And that's really it's the most effective kind of improvisation that I've ever encountered, because it's very strict, it's very disciplined. You learn something very basic at the very beginning of theater games, where, by the way, being funny is not the objective and you're discouraged from joke making. But the basic thing you learn is to connect with the other player. And that's why I think it's the best training for acting. Because if you don't have that connection with the other person, it's a fraudulent encounter. You're pretending to encounter the other person. And there's something even at an unconscious level, I think, that shows like pretense. I don't think it's true that it's like children saying, let's pretend we're kings and queens. It's not pretending. It's an act of imagination that's mutual, that you enter into it together, and you agree on the circumstances. So as a result, to skip ahead, I've always been interested in science, and when I did the science program on public television for 11 years, I realized that it was working. The conversations I had with the scientists were working because we had the same contact that you get when you work in an improvisation that's of the kind that Viola would work on. So I realized when we were doing the show that I was helping them by connecting with them, helping them to tell their story to a human, not to go into a mini lecture that was full of words that were difficult to understand, concepts that were difficult. So I thought, what if we could train them to make that kind of contact so they could not just make it with another person, but make it with a whole audience, whether the audience was there or reading a book they wrote. What are they thinking while you talk to them? What's going on in the other person? In other words, empathy. So that's when I helped start the Alda Center for Communicating Science, which is at Stony Brook University. And we've trained, starting with improvisation exercises and then moving on to other exercises. We've trained over 15,000 scientists and doctors in 10 years.
And it all came out of your training with Paul Sills and so forth?
Yeah, it turns out, in my opinion, it's not just the best basis for acting, that kind of improvising. It's the best basis for human interaction. Lawyers benefit from it. On my podcast, I talked to a hostage negotiator who would work for 2 years sometimes to get a hostage released. And he would do it by thinking about what that hostage taker was going through, what the hostage taker believed in. And he would let him know he understood. He didn't agree or disagree. He just let him know he understood what was going on in the person's mind. And he'd get the hostage released. And he said, these same techniques can be used in a marriage. He said that, and I think it's true.
Do the SAG audience have to worry now that these 15,000 scientists are going to be joining the
I'll tell you,
guild?
what's so funny? I was asked to go to the Lynn Fontanne house where they do a program every year to work with 10 or 20 actors from theaters around the country, very experienced actors. And I was asked to come spend a week or 10 days, and I could do anything I wanted. I could work on, various people have done Shakespeare, musical theater. And I said, because I value spontaneity so much, I wanted to spend the week on spontaneity, and the way we'd be doing that would be improvising for the whole week. The actors were not necessarily unafraid. In fact, when we started, they said, are we better than the scientists? And one woman who, my heart really went out there. She had 30 years experience, sorry. She had 30 years experience on the stage. She was so afraid of improvising, she was planning to stage a fake heart attack. And she made the most progress because she wanted to work on a scene. She had brought a copy of Dürrenmatt's The Visit. So she and another actor read the scene where she meets up with this guy who has seduced her and abandoned her in the past, and now she's come back as a rich woman to the town and wants justice. And she's got anger, a steaming anger toward him and even toward the baby that came out of their relationship. So they read the scene and they were very good. It was a first reading, but they're experienced actors. It was a really good reading. Then I asked them to go back and play a scene, to improvise a scene that's not in the play, that was the moment in the woods when he actually let her know he wasn't going to marry her and that he was dumping her. So at first, they did what most of us do. They were standing there making up dialogue, and it was a little boring. But the way you get out of that in these exercises is to use the place to act on the environment and let that become part of it, and then you forget about what you're saying and real stuff comes out of you. And at one point, when I said, start using the environment, use the place, and she said to him, don't you want to marry me? And he said, oh, look, it's raining, and the rain just hits you right there in the nose. She was devastated. And then as soon as they finished that, we went back and they read the scene again. It was fantastic. The anger she had toward him came from her guts because she had not just imagined being rejected by him, she had just lived through it. And even her anger at the baby that they had, which is hard to draw up without a lot of thinking about, a lot of effort for most people. Boy, that just burst out of her. It was great.
I'm wondering, I'm going to shift gears.
I haven't let you ask many questions, I'm sorry. No, you seem like a very nice person.
Thank you. Thank you. Given the extraordinary results that improv has brought you, I'm wondering, did this influence you once you became a screenwriter, once you started writing for MASH in 1973? Did you utilize any of this kind of chemistry that comes out of improv to help
I
you
think
write?
all my life, since I started thinking about improv, all my professional life, I've tried to use the relating that I learned from it, the ability to relate. And that, to me, I think it's a major part of the acting experience. So I have always used it. In writing, I think one of the things about how improv can help writing, and it's not the only way, but a way that seems important to me is when you get in touch with the ability to contact another person, you get more empathic, you understand characters at a deeper level. So that affects the writing. It also puts you in touch with your own unconscious a little more. Yeah. And as things are poking their way to the top, you can pull them out with associations. I think associative thinking is probably how the original stuff comes to the surface. I once read a story, and I haven't been able to track it down. There was supposed to be an account of something Freud had written. There was a myth about a goat herder who kept his goats in a cave with a big rock blocking the entrance to the cave. And when he let them out in the morning, he let the weak ones out first, the sick ones, the ones that were not useful to him as much as the others, in case there was somebody out there throwing rocks at them. And the really valuable ones came out last. And the image is, the meaning of the myth is, don't knock your early ideas. The weak ones are coming out, but they're leading through an associative process to the ones behind them. Don't give up because you get a lousy idea. The first ones are supposed to be lousy. Your first draft is supposed to stink. But it leads to the second one, and some of the elements that brought forth the first one are pulling up the ones behind them. And eventually you'll get the golden ones. And have patience, and don't editorialize while you're still creating. You got to break it into two things. Once it all comes out and it gets on paper, then you should attack it objectively. But first it should be very subjective. I never been able to track that down. I don't know if Freud ever wrote about that or not.
Wow.
Maybe I made it up.
It's part of the creative process. You joined MASH in 1972, and a year later began writing scripts.
I think the first script I wrote was at the end of the first year. I may be
Okay,
wrong.
okay.
I think so.
Was this a natural transition?
Well,
for you?
I'd wanted to be a writer from the time I was 8 years old. And it was only later in life, when I was 9, I wanted to be an actor. And I wrote, I made I would shoot little movies on a wind-up Bell and Howell camera. And I wrote a newspaper or a magazine kind of thing that I published on a mimeograph machine and delivered on a horse in the canyon where we lived.
Seriously?
Yeah, seriously. And one time I was leaning over from the top of my horse, stuffing the magazine into a mailbox. And the guy said, "Oh, I like that paper." I said, "Oh, thanks." He said, "What do you mean, thanks?" I said, "Well, I write it." He says, "You write it?" I was about 11. He says, "I like that." So you can't judge things according to people's age.
You began writing, and then...
Oh, by the way, the reason he liked it so much was I stole a lot of the material that I put in there. I think I was too young to know about copyright.
From writing, you then went to directing episodes of MASH, often the ones that you had written.
Yeah.
Can you talk about this through line? How did directing add to your ability to understand acting?
From the time I was a kid, I was interested in telling a story visually. And I was very lucky that they trusted me with directing the first show, but the first show was a real test. It involved a picnic with about 80 people, and I covered it with 7 cameras. And that's, for your first directing job, that's kind of a lot to take on. And it went okay, and that night I was catching a plane back to spend the weekend with my family in New Jersey. And I remember skipping down the sidewalk saying, "I can do it, I can do it."
Did that spur greater interest in maybe concentrating on directing, or it was always going to be a triple threat when it came to you? Writing, acting, directing?
You're right, it's a triple threat. When you
Well,
write...
that's the wrong word.
No, it's true. When you write, direct, and act in the same piece, there are 3 ways they can kill you. And it's not that easy to do. I don't think I did my best in any of those categories while I was trying to do them all at the same time.
Well, I think we could dispute that, especially once you get to your feature film career, beginning in 1979 with The Seduction of Joe Tynan. You wrote...
No, I didn't direct that.
Oh, you didn't direct it?
No,
Yeah.
what's his name? I forget his name right now.
Jerry Schatzberg.
What?
Jerry Schatzberg.
Thank you, Jerry Schatzberg. Thank you.
Oh, the 4 seasons then.
4 seasons. That I was very proud of. Thank you. Thank you.
Talk a little about being a triple threat.
Well, one thing that's hard to do is to be objective about your own performance. So I would, when I was in the scene, especially a close-up, I'd shoot more takes of that and try to give myself more options in the editing room. And that led to the crew saying, look what a narcissist he is. It was only to give myself options, I swear to God. You believe me. You believe me, don't you?
Did this multiple take continue in your subsequent films, or did the first film teach you how to
No, but you
direct
know what
yourself?
I finally learned to do? When I remember one time in an early movie I was in, that where the director didn't want me to look at the rushes. And I thought it was so important to see the rushes, to find out what I was doing wrong and fix it, which is probably the worst thing you can do, because then the movie is all about you trying not to do things, rather than giving an open, honest, fresh performance. So one time I even snuck into the projection booth through the attic so I could watch the rushes. And I wasn't very good in that picture either. But then I realized that it's really like improv. You do it and it disappears into the ether, and you don't have to worry about it. It's either good or it's not good. If it's happening while you do it, that's what matters. But to get into a situation where you're telling yourself what to do because you saw something you didn't like before, it's all backwards. So for me, anyway, I don't look at it.
How about writing for yourself, in the sense that you're writing with your characteristics in mind?
I don't do that. I don't think I've ever done that. I write for the character, and I try to make it a character that's in my range, but as interesting I can make. But I don't always understand what I'm writing. One time I was writing the character that I was going to play in 4 Seasons, and I was struggling to find out who he was. And I had written a couple of scenes that seemed to make an impression on me. And I was taking a shower and thinking about it. You know, in the shower you get deep thoughts, you know. And I stepped out of the shower and I said to my wife, Arlene, I finally figured out who this guy is. It's my father. And she said, you're kidding, right? And I said, no, what? She said, it's you. Which kind of took me down a peg, because he wasn't that admirable a person. You know, the Budinsky thought he knew everything. The bitch.
After the 4 Seasons, this was followed a few years later with Sweet Liberty.
Right.
Did you sense something different doing a second film as a triple threat from your first?
Interestingly, on that movie, I was very interested in preparing every shot. I storyboarded the whole thing. I went out with the photographer and figured out what lens we'd use in every scene, where the track would go. When I would get on the set in the morning at 8 o'clock, the track would already be down because everybody knew what to do. Then when I got to the last picture I directed, I improvised the directing part a little more. I didn't plan the shots like that. I didn't have a storyboard. I'd get on the set and I'd think, let's see, where should we put the camera? And as soon as I did that, the crew didn't think I knew anything. And it didn't go well.
Oh.
Yeah.
So they prefer a...
Well, everybody prefers that you know what you're doing. I think I prefer it, too.
One of your greatest comic roles was in Woody Allen's Crime and Misdemeanors.
I love that movie.
The Hollywood-based director, Lester. Could you talk about what Woody Allen was like as a director and what you learned working with him?
Woody doesn't like to talk to people, I think, or at least when I worked with him, he didn't. And that extended all the way to actors. You and I have talked more now than I did with him in 3 movies. And so there was not much conversation. I came into the first scene, and it was in a real apartment, and it was already lit, and other actors were sitting in their places. I don't know why they called me so late. But I walk in and Woody said, "Hi." I said, "Hi." He said, "Why don't you sit over there? And about halfway through the scene, whenever you feel like it, go from sitting next to her to sitting next to her." "Okay, are we ready?" She was my sister and she was my mistress. And I hadn't even been introduced to them. So I think part of his, and then I figured out how to work it, and I got very improvisational. Well, something I really loved about working with him was that he really valued improvisation, and he didn't mind. I would improvise my way through a whole scene. Once in a while, he'd say, "Try to include that line I have in there because I use it later in the script." And that was really fun for me.
So there was no directing per se, other than
no. His way at that time was, if he didn't like the way, he only did 2 or 3 takes. If he didn't like the way it went, he would call you back a month later and you'd do it again. And if he didn't like that, you might get called back a 3rd time, and then you'd be fired. After the first day, I wouldn't have minded being fired, but then. And by the 2nd day, I caught on, and I really loved working. I loved the experience, and I loved that movie. I think it's one of our best movies.
Absolutely. And this same experience happened on the 2nd, and then your 3rd film with him was a musical.
Yeah, that was one. I wish he had done more of those. It was really entertaining.
Mm-hmm. What was it like doing a musical Woody Allen film?
He wanted you to sing as badly as you could. He had the idea that the people should sound like normal people. In fact, one of the actresses in the movie said, "I can't sing at all, I can't do it." So he got somebody to sing for her that she would lip sync. He got a high school girl who had never sung before.
Okay.
So he was kind of determined not to have great singing. He told the leading actress, who was a great singer, he said, "Don't, try not to sing so well." Fortunately, I didn't need to be advised to do that.
In the 90s, you took another new direction and you became host of PBS's Scientific American Frontiers. Was this something that came out of the blue, or were you curious about
I thought it came out of the blue. I think that they sent me a letter that that they must have sent to other people, and that they might have sent it to me because I had played a doctor on television, so I had something vaguely to do with science. I don't know if they realized I had such a great interest in science. I should have known because the letter was addressed to Dear Occupant. Just kidding, but I like that joke. But I said that I hoped that they would let me interview the scientists and not just come on camera to introduce the show and then read a narration. Mm-hmm. Because if I could interview them, then I could spend the day with them and really learn about their work, which we did, and it was a great education for me in many ways.
Mm-hmm. You returned to Broadway in the 90s, first in Neil Simon's Jake's Women. Had Broadway changed since your early days in the 60s there, or?
I guess it had, but I don't know how. Do you know? Did you keep track of that? I just don't have an answer to that.
Yeah, okay. You've worked with Neil Simon a couple of times.
Oh, yeah, I made a movie that he wrote, and the
California
play.
Suite.
Yeah.
And what was it like working with him on Broadway?
Neil was so tuned in to the audience reaction, it was startling. He had tried the show out in La Jolla or someplace like that in Southern California, and didn't like the way it went and fired everybody and closed the show. Then started a new production that I was in, and we tried it out one night in front of an invited audience the night before we were going to go to New York and start working on it there. And it didn't get many laughs. And he said to me, "Oh, I guess I'm going to have to close this." And I said, "Neil, look, you're funny, I'm funny. We're going to get laughs when we have a real audience. This is an invited audience. It's the first time we've faced them. Let's have faith in ourselves. And it didn't get great reviews, but it ran a season, and we got away with it.
You've created iconic roles on television, first in MASH, and then in 2004 you went to The West Wing. Can you talk about what it was like working on this pivotal dream fantasy series?
I felt I learned a lot about politics from reading the scripts, because they were written by people with a lot of experience in politics, real experience running campaigns and being in the staff of the Senate or the House. And it was very interesting to me to see the discussions that would go on before a statement was released, and every word would be vetted because it would reflect how it connected to the constituency and that kind of thing. Each word could appeal to a different constituency. It was very interesting to me.
Sounds like an alternate universe now.
Well, yeah, we don't get that impression now.
Yeah. But working on the series, did it reflect differently than MASH in terms of how TV was made about 20 years later, or?
No, they were both shot with one camera and the same kind of schedule. I didn't see any. I'm not aware of many changes. I'm disappointing you with that. I'm sorry.
No, it's nice to hear there's some continuity somewhere.
Well, maybe I'm just not noticing it. You're making me scared here.
You did series parts in lots of shows, 30 Rock, The Big C, The Blacklist, and a program I don't know how many people have seen, but I thought you delivered one of your most remarkable performances in Horace and Pete.
Oh, I love that show. That is so good. He's a remarkable writer, Louis C.K., and we did it like a play. It was a little like the old U.S. Steel Hour in the 50s. Several cameras, and we rehearsed it like a play and shot it like a play. He wanted to try, and I think he did, put up on the internet the whole uncut version of what we did all the way through. I don't think he cut it, or he might have made a few small edits. But it had the energy of a live performance because of that.
Your most recent work is the remarkable Marriage Story, Noah Baumbach, and I wonder if you could talk about your work on this film, where you play one of the few decent lawyers in the film.
Right. Well, he's decent, and he's so decent, you see he has a shabby office. I love this movie, and I'm very proud to be in it because it's so remarkable. It not only is a movie about people, but it's a movie that takes a risk that you wouldn't expect somebody to take in a commercial environment. It's about divorce, which turns people off. I wrote a movie about a divorce, and one of the audience surveys had someone saying, I didn't go see it because I figured if Alan Alda did a movie about divorce, it would be painful, and I didn't want the pain. Because I wouldn't just treat it like a joke. I would try to get into the reality of it. And Noah does that. But what's amazing to me about what he's able to do, Noah Baumbach, the director, writer, what I find amazing that he can do is tell a love story that continues right straight through the divorce, even though they have heartbreaking fights. You can see that these are fights between two people who deeply love each other. And it's very much like, I don't mean to drag this in by the heels, but it's very much like what we talk about on my podcast, which is relating and communicating. The idea that in a marriage you have to communicate really well to keep going through a marriage, especially with the introduction of children and professional concerns. And when you start to think about a divorce, it's often because communication is broken down. Then you find out that during the divorce, you have to communicate better than you ever did earlier in the marriage. And if you don't, there's going to be a lot of pain for everybody involved. And Noah shows that. And it's an emotional workout, I think. And like a workout at a gym, it can do you good. It might not feel great while you're going through it. But to stir up those emotions, to have the empathy for the people who are going through it is a valuable experience. Plus, he's able to find out what's funny about these things. Sometimes it's funny and painful at the same time. So I love this movie. And it also gives me a chance to talk about my podcast.
Let's talk about your podcast.
I love this podcast.
Which is called Clear and Vivid.
It's called Clear and Vivid, and the idea is that I've now had 70 conversations with people like Yo-Yo Ma and Madeleine Albright and Michael J. Fox and Sarah Silverman. Sarah Silverman had one of the most extraordinary stories to tell. And all these stories are about relating to other people and communicating what goes into communicating. And over again, you hear, very much like what we were talking about before, being aware of what's happening in the other person. Not what you want them to get from you, but what they're able to get from you. Where are they? Who are they? What are they going through? What can I say that speaks to that? Otherwise, I'm just spraying stuff all over you. It's not getting in. Sarah Silverman's story was amazing, and it's just one example of many. She was looking at her Twitter feed, and somebody had tweeted a one-word insult to her, like the worst insult you can give to a woman. So instead of blocking him or doing a tirade, she looked up his profile and found out he was suffering from back pain. And she wrote him on Twitter, messaged him, and said, I'm in pain in my back too. I know what that's like. And sometimes I think anger comes out of pain. And I think that's why you were angry toward me. Why don't you try to speak from a place of love? And he wrote back and said, I have no place of love that was ripped out of me by a man who abused me when I was a child. She then found a place where he could get therapy for free. He went to the therapy, changed his life. They're now best friends on the internet. Is that amazing?
Wow.
But there's stories of how diplomats were able, how George Mitchell was able to stop the violence in Ireland by bringing people together. He said, we're going to have dinner every night for the next week. During the day, we can talk business and yell at each other. At night, you can't say anything having to do with business, none of these negotiations. At night, we're going to talk to each other about our childhoods, our families, our pets, the things we care about in life. That's all we're going to talk about. They talked civilly to each other. Each day it was harder to yell at this other person who you knew was just like you. Stories like that over and over again. I learn a lot talking to these people. And we use the same techniques I was talking with you about before. I don't go in with a list of questions. Nothing personal, by the way. Most interviews involve a list of questions. But, that sometimes, not in our case, but it sometimes leads to not really hearing the answer to the question because you know you have this next question to get to. Whereas if you ask about what you're actually curious about and hear the answer and want the person to tell you more about that, or it reminds you of something in your own life and you say it's like that. Is that like that for you? Where you start to share a conversation and you have a communication partner. That's such a different experience. And that's what I try to do on the show. And I see people opening up. And it's very enlightening when they do, because these are people with enormous experience. And Yo-Yo Ma then can talk about how he relates to the other players when he's playing with other musicians, how he relates to the audience, how he deals with his nervousness about an audience. And it has to do with relating. He said he used to be very nervous when he was younger, coming out to do a concert. And then he realized that if he looked at it this way, he wouldn't be nervous. He now comes out and thinks, I've invited these people to my party, and I'm going to serve them food and drink and music, and we're all going to have a good time together. All of a sudden, they become real people. They're not this monster in the dark. Nothing personal.
Looking back, you have worked with some of the greatest directors in the world. Scorsese, you worked with him on The Aviator. You got an Oscar nomination for your role there. You've worked with Mike Nichols. You have worked with Noah Baumbach. You've worked with Woody Allen. I'm wondering if you can.
I was the best. You left out Spielberg. I worked with him too.
Yes,
I've been so lucky. And I would watch them carefully every minute to try to learn from them. And they like to talk. They like to explain. Somebody once told me he met Charlie Chaplin 20 or 30 years after he had made movies, and he said he loved to explain the fight scene that he did that took 6 weeks to stage, and he explained it moment by moment, shot by shot. And that's what I find often great directors love to do. If you ask them a question about a particular scene or a shot, how did you get that? They like to pass it on. It's very nice. I got that with Scorsese and with Spielberg. I enjoyed that.
We're with an audience of actors who hopefully will also work with great directors. I wonder if you could share your insight about some kind of common thread of what great directors do with actors that might be different than not so great directors.
No, I can't.
Okay.
I'll tell you, the reason I can't is that every director I've worked with has been different. I think a directing style may stem from a personal style of living, to the way they organize their lives on the set. To get through a harrowing series of tasks and 200 people lining up to ask you questions all day long, you got to have a style of working that suits you, I'm guessing. And some Woody doesn't, or at least when I worked with him, didn't like to talk. Marty Scorsese loves to talk.
Spielberg?
Same thing. He very much enjoyed talking about things. But how they offer you suggestions about how you're acting is different for everybody. And I think it's the only advice I could possibly give, I think, is to reverse the process we've been talking about in terms of communication. To receive a communication, you have to go through a similar process of listening well, trying to read the other person, not only what they're saying, but what's under what they're saying. An employer tries to communicate with an employee. The employee has to go to the same effort to get good leadership out of the employer. You can't just take it at face value and say, well, you didn't tell me that. You know, you got to be a team, and both people can benefit from trying to be a team. And I think the actor, the same thing. if you have only one way of working and the director doesn't fit into that, it's going to be unfortunate. I think we have to be flexible. It's easier for me to say because I feel like I invent a different method every time I do a different part.
Really? And
Yeah.
that method is coming, though, from a base of listening and empathy.
I guess, I don't know. I make it up as I go along.
Okay. Let me turn to our audience who have written some questions. Let's see. You've played a lot of political roles in your career. How do you approach them? And do you have any thoughts, well, this is too incendiary, about our current political climate?
No, I was a political activist when I was much younger, 45 or 50 years ago, and I worked very hard to try to get the Equal Rights Amendment ratified. I publicly identified as a feminist and worked hard for the cause of gender equality. And I felt after the Equal Rights Amendment failed to be ratified, that it was time for me to concentrate on what I know how to do best, which is act and write. And now teach communication and help run an organization that is spreading these ideas around the world. And particularly the communication of science. I don't want to politicize science or politicize my work by talking in public about current politics. I have my own ideas, but I don't want to use any platform I have for that. I have a longer range plan to help communication improve, which I hope will help our political interactions improve.
Here's a speculative question. What role or roles would you love to play that you haven't had a chance to yet?
Anne Frank.
Okay.
The thing is, I really do regard my whole life and so-called career as an improv. All I've ever done is take what comes my way and try to make the most of it. I haven't hankered after playing anything.
There's no King Lear in the future?
I don't really like King Lear. I love Shakespeare and and he's an astonishing genius. But I never understood King Lear. I'd be happy to talk to somebody who's played it, who can explain it to me, but he seems like a dope to me.
Okay.
Is that going to be the headline of this thing?
Alda says,
Yeah.
Lear a dope.
Dear William,
You blew it.
Yeah.
Okay. As actors, we have dream jobs where cast and crew get along like a loving family, and nightmare jobs where it is a constant clash of egos. Without naming names, how did you handle the difficult jobs?
Well, I missed something in the beginning, in the middle.
The basic thing is, how do you handle a set where it is not working well?
Oh,
Where there's tension,
yeah.
a lack of communication?
Yeah, the ideal thing would be to communicate better and not get pissed. I'm going to try that next.
Okay. Your dad was a Burlesque, that's what it says, a Burlesque performer, and you used to travel with him. What memories do you have of those comics and strippers? We've heard about the strippers. And did your dad ever let you do any burlesque bits with him?
Well, they carried me on stage when I was 6 months old.
Right.
And they tell me that there was a bell on the high chair they put me in, and I kept ringing the bell right on top of all their punchlines. So I had early training in stealing the scene. You know? But yeah, the chorus girls were very sweet to me. They took me up to the dressing room, and I was sort of their mascot, and they would comb my hair and pat my cheek, and then they'd say, "Okay, Allie, we're going to change our clothes now. Turn your back." And I'd turn around with my face against the wall with my nose in their costumes, and I could smell the perfume and the sweat on the costumes. And behind me, I could hear them putting on their silk costumes. And they thought it didn't mean anything to me. I get excited just thinking about it now.
This
I'm
kind
not done yet.
I was going to ask, but you kind of answered it. Looking back on your long career, is there a favorite role? And I guess being...
Yeah, no, I don't think there is. The favorite moments, things that come back to me from time to time that I relish. One you'd never think of. There were two guys from Britain who did a play called The Play What I Wrote. Yes. And every night in the second act, they had an actor or somebody well-known come in to do the second act with them. And you had to learn a song and a dance, and you had to learn a lot of dialogue. You were a real part of the second act. And I loved doing it. And at one point I was playing Count Toblerone, who had been imprisoned in a French prison. And to escape, he had to put on a hoop skirt. So I put on the hoop skirt, and I'm singing and dancing in my hoop skirt, and I trip on the skirt and fall down. One of the memorable moments in my life. It's so important. They don't teach you in acting school, don't trip on the hoop skirt. But I never went to acting school, so I wouldn't have known anyway. But there are little moments like that I think of. Mm-hmm. And I think of that, you know, sometimes people say, who's your favorite actor? And I don't think of a favorite actor. I think of moments that I've seen that I admired. And
can you share some of them with us?
I once saw, I was at a dinner honoring Anthony Hopkins, and it was interesting. There was a reel of his work, and almost every single clip, going back to when he was a young actor, was authentic and invested. And that's the closest I came, because every one of those, almost every one of those clips was a memorable moment where he really connected. And then there's that moment in the back of the car when Brando shakes his head and says, no, I forget what he says.
That could have been a contender.
No, not it's in that scene, but the other guy takes a gun out.
Rod Steiger.
Yeah, he takes a gun out, and he says, no. And I always admired that. Then I heard later, I don't know if it's true, he was thinking, don't act like that. But you got to make use of whatever you got, you know.
I'm trying to recall the film, but there was a moment, it was after MASH, where you kind of shifted gears and started playing darker roles, even villainous roles. Was this a conscious decision to try your...
The only conscious part of what you're describing is that when I did A New Life, I deliberately wrote the character much more rough-hewn than other parts I'd recently played because of what you're talking about. But the fact is, I've played flawed people most of the time, including Hawkeye. Hawkeye was a flawed character. It could be that in my real life, I created a stereotype when I would be interviewed on television that slopped over into my artistic life. I'm not sure. I mean, that may be something in favor of the point of view of some actors who don't like to show up as themselves and only like to show up as one character or another. But more and more, when you talk about changes in the business, it wasn't considered part of your job when I started making movies that you would go on the road for a month promoting it. You might be asked to do an interview, but it wasn't. Now it's in your contract. And I understand that, but it's a little bit connected to the idea that I always regretted it when 2 or 3 decades ago, they started referring to movies as product. It's not a product. At its best, it's a work of art. And I also have another reaction to, and I say this gently because I'm not trying to criticize anybody, but it's common for now the public to talk about actors practicing their craft. You can do acting as a craft. You can also do it as an art. You can try to be an artist. To me, a craft is painting flowers on a dish. And there's nothing wrong with that. But there's a difference between that and trying to be like Rembrandt and put character into a face. That's different. And if you aspired to that, it's different from being a craft. What were we talking about before I got onto this?
I feel that the time we've spent together has been a true education in terms of how to approach the art of acting, and I would say the art of communicating. And I think I speak for everyone in thanking you for sharing such important life lessons with us.
Oh my God, look. Oh, thank you.